Everyone, my name is Audrey Tan. I'm an impact manager with Equalise ESRC Centre for Lifecourse Health Equity. I'm based at University College London, and I'm also part of UPEN's Professional Development Subcommittee. Today's session is the second part of our AI webinar series, focusing on the use of AI in facilitating academic policy engagement. So if you were at last week's session, that was held by Elise and her colleagues about how AI can facilitate engagement activities with policy engagement. And today I'll be going through how AI can support stakeholder mapping. And I'll be using an example, a case study from an activity that I actually ran within my team. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or you raise your hand. I'll leave lots of opportunities for asking questions throughout. So the topics that we'll be covering today is the purpose of stakeholder mapping and how it can be a really valuable tool for your project or team. The steps for actually going about creating a stakeholder map. So that's where I'll be using the worked example of the activity that I ran. And then once you have your beautiful map, how you can actually engage stakeholders that you've identified. Some background information for how I came up with today's content. I have a background as a systematic reviewer, where we usually employ a lot of really systematic step-by-step processes to identify every relevant paper. So I've used that sort of mission and method here, and I've feel a little bit like a border collie. So when I've started doing stakeholder mapping, my goal has always been identify as many relevant stakeholders as possible. And if you are out there, I will find you. So that's just to say today's methods have been built through guidance that I developed and read online, but also just through lived experience as a systematic reviewer, employing different methods for trying to make sure that as many resources are checked and as many stakeholders are identified. I also realized that I'm today wearing the same dress that I have in my picture there. So let's jump into it. The purpose of stakeholder mapping. So what exactly is it? So it's the systematic identification, evaluation, and prioritization of everyone who can influence or has an interest in a project, program, or organization. Stakeholder mappings can be really useful for both project work or teamwork, or even if you're an individual academic or staff member, just trying to see who else is out there working in your space. There's a couple of different terms as well. So there's stakeholder analysis, which is that whole process of identifying, evaluating, prioritizing everyone who can influence your project. And it's a really great way to develop an effective stakeholder communication and engagement strategy. A really effective way for doing this stakeholder analysis technique is a stakeholder mapping. So that's where you have a whole bunch of your different stakeholders and then place them on a different matrix plotted against two different variables to clearly identify key players who can have the greatest impact on the success of your work. And this is a really helpful way for you to be able to identify how you can prioritize resources, both financially, but also time-wise, and creating a foundation for communications and engagement plan. And the stakeholder matrix is the actual visual representation of the different priority groups. So this is an example of a typical and commonly used stakeholder matrix. Two commonly used variables are influence or power and interest. So how relevant is your work to different stakeholders, but also how much power, how much leverage do they have within the environment or the sector? And then depending on where the quadrants, where they lie within the quadrants, this will sort of give you an indication of how much resources you should actually put into engaging with them. And this can be really, really helpful in terms of helping you identify your engagement strategy. So if they have a lot of influence in the sector and are also really relevant, high interest, then that's sort of your highest priority stakeholder group, and you'd want to manage them very closely. So work on building relationships with them, have a very bespoke engagement plan, and involve them in, if possible, in co-production in your work. Very similarly, again, if they have high influence within your field, but slightly less relevant to your areas of work, maybe there's only a portion of their priorities that align with your program, then you'd want to sort of work around satisfying. So considering their objectives and how they align with yours and see if you can bring them along as strong advocates. Then in the sort of lower priority groups, you'd have people who have slightly less influence in the field, but if they're really, really relevant, maybe it's a grassroots organization, you'd still want to be in touch with them to inform them about the work that you're doing, consulting on their areas and seeing if their input can improve the work that you're doing. And then for the lowest priority, so low interest, but also low influence, you might want to reach out to them on social media, see if they want to follow you back, see if they want to follow your newsletter, but you wouldn't be investing too much time in terms of engaging with them. Um, Oops, sorry, did not mean to jump ahead there. Someone has asked me if where they can find this matrix, and I think actually a couple of years ago I made this myself. So if this is something that you want to share with colleagues, do feel free to do so. I'll be sharing it afterwards, and feel free to credit me if you think it's useful. Here's some other examples of stakeholder maps with the 4 different quadrants, but you also see a worked example on the right. So the stakeholder mapping can be really useful and really relevant for a number of reasons. First, it helps to prioritize stakeholders because I think most people are working in an environment where you have limited capacity, both time, in terms of time and resources. So it's a really great way to identify where is it actually going to be the best bang for our buck. It's also really important to understand the key stakeholders. What agendas are they working towards? What networks and connections do they already have that you'd be able to leverage and join? Building relationships from the beginning is also a great way to co-produce, integrate co-production into your work, and co-production also increases the likelihood that the relevance of your work and also of the ability for your work and the findings to actually have real-world impact. And it also creates a foundation for engagement strategies, and I'll go into this in more detail later on. So in terms of when to perform a stakeholder mapping, it's not really great if you wait until the very end of your project, because then at that point, people that you do identify, it's probably a little bit too late to integrate them into your project if your project's already towards the end. Maybe you could reach out to them and it could help you with your dissemination, but how much impact can you really generate just by, sending out pieces of work that are already finished? So if possible, it's really great to do stakeholder mapping at the beginning of a project or as early on as possible, because then it can give you an idea of what the sector looks like, what the wider environment looks like, and the context you're working in. And it gives you the opportunity to start building those connections early on, and being able to bring people into your project so that they can work alongside you. So I mean, if you already are towards the end of the project, it's not the end of the world. There's no wrong time to do a stakeholder mapping, but if it is possible for you to do something, do it at the beginning, that is more ideal. Also, it's not a one and done sort of activity. Stakeholder maps are not static, and the way that they're going to be most useful for you is if you iterate them over sort of a regular period of time, so annually or every 6 months, just reviewing to see, because the environment in the sector is always going to be changing. Are there any questions about sort of the principles and theory behind stakeholder mapping before we get into the actual steps? Um, Someone's written, it's also good for MEL, especially for policy engagement. I'm sorry, but I feel a bit ignorant, but what does MEL mean? Okay, I'm not the only one. Someone else has asked what MEL means. Monitoring. Okay, yes. So monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So, if you're going to set out to do a stakeholder map, the first thing that you want to do is to identify your scope, because if you don't have sort of parameters that you're working in, your stakeholder map could go on forever, but also it's not going to be particularly useful to you. So first you want to outline the context. So is there a specific geographic area that you're looking to work to identify people in? Are you looking for a specific type of stakeholders, or are you only looking for policymakers, or are you only looking for people who work within industry? You also want to define the aims and objectives. So what are you actually trying to achieve with this stakeholder map? Are you looking for people who are already working on similar projects, or are you looking for maybe funders specific to this area? So it's really important that you know what you're actually going to be doing with this map before you start, so you have a clear idea of who you're actually looking for. Then you want to identify the most relevant groups. If you're doing a stakeholder map that includes policymakers or policy professionals, remember that there's the visible and formal decision makers like the Prime Minister, government ministers, MPs, parliamentarians, but then there's also the hidden and informal decision makers. So people that you might not necessarily think immediately of as policymakers, but these are people who play key roles in the development of policy. So people working at think tanks, trade associations or unions, lobbyists, learned societies, campaigners in civil society, and charities and NGOs. And then lastly, consider how the results are going to be used. So uh, this is when you're thinking about what are you actually doing. So once you've got your beautiful stakeholder matrix, you've got your 4 different priority groups, now what? What are you actually going to do with those results? So making sure it's really important that you have all of these things considered before you get started. So now I'm going to introduce the worked example. So for each step, I'm going to actually demonstrate what I actually did within my research center. So just as a brief introduction, I work for Equalise. We're a £7 million ESRC funded research center. It started in 2029 and actually will be running through to 2030 now. And we focus on tackling health inequalities across the UK, across the Lifecourse, using mixed methods approaches. So the scope for our stakeholder map, the context was that we were looking for stakeholders related to Equalise themes in the UK. So Equalise is split across 4 work programs that focus on care, place, learning, and work. And the data that we're using is UK data. So that's why we wanted to look for only UK-based stakeholders. We weren't running an international map, and we wanted stakeholders relevant to our 4 different working themes. The aims and objectives were to identify stakeholders beyond our current list of partners that we could collaborate with, so bring them into different research projects that are ongoing, share findings, engage with, and be able to assist us with recruitment to our public engagement panels. Relevant groups included other academic groups, advocacy, people working basically across the third sector, and policymakers. And the use of the map, the reason that what we would be doing with the results afterwards would be to inform our stakeholder engagement plan. So the next step, once you've got your scope, is to choose items for your data collection relevant to the scope. So this is, if you've ever done a systematic review or a literature review, this will look very much similar to your data collection tool. So options that you might want to gather include the name of the organization. That's probably pretty self-evident. It can be useful to get the name of a key contact person and their job title, social media handles, the type of stakeholder that they are. So are they from the policy world, third sector, academia, geographic area, if that's relevant, if you're looking for people within specific countries, and the focus and the role. So for Equalise, the data that I was looking for when I was doing my initial sort of desk-based search for stakeholders was names of the organization, a contact email, the link to the website, so that way when I was sharing it with my colleagues, they could easily click on the website to find out more. Because we were specifically interested in stakeholders within the UK, but also we wanted to have a focus on where we wanted to ensure that we had stakeholders across the devolved nations. I also had a column for the nation. And then because not all, I knew that not all of my colleagues would be familiar with the names of the organization, I also had a one-liner describing the focus of the role. I realized afterwards that probably it wasn't super relevant to pull out the email addresses because, as I'll show you later on with the AI process that I ran, the AI could only pull out generic email addresses, which are not super relevant. And if once you actually go to engaging people, you want individual emails. So if I was to do this again, I wouldn't have bothered drawing out email addresses from the very beginning. So before you start putting people in quadrants, basically what you want to do is have a long list of your potential stakeholders relevant to your area. I used AI to help me create the initial list of stakeholders that would then be mapped. And the prompt wording that I did was create a list of organizations, charities, academics based in the UK active in addressing, and then I ran this prompt 4 times, one for each of the different thematic areas within my team. And I did this. I ran it separately, the prompt separately for the 4 themes because I wanted to have a stakeholder map specific to each of the 4 themes. Equally, if you have an existing list of stakeholders, say you've already got, or if you're already aware of 5 to 10 stakeholders who are super relevant to your work, you can work backwards from that. So in whichever AI platform you use, you could prompt it to say, find organizations in this X area similar to, and then copy in your list of stakeholders. If you are going to use AI to help generate that initial list of stakeholders, make sure that you review the output and consolidate it with existing known stakeholders, and also triangulate this with a hand-based internet search, social media search, and it's also really important to be able to triangulate with colleagues. So once I created my consolidated lists of stakeholders, I sent these to all of my thematic teams to see if there was anything that I had missed. It's really important to consider some things when you're using an AI platform. And if you were at the session last week, this will all be probably sound pretty familiar to you. So just remember of the environmental impact. So I tried to use AI. I tried to use AI Copilot in this instance, really only for the key bits and key tasks like identifying the stakeholders. Review generated outputs to ensure they're valid and real. AI is known for hallucinations, which means just randomly coming up with things that don't actually exist. So you do need to check every stakeholder that comes up to make sure that it is real. And a huge weakness of large language models is the lack of reproducibility. So I found that the same prompt will actually generate different results each time. So I did this first sort of desk-based search over a couple of days, and I found that the prompt would produce different results each time. So you might have to play around with different prompt wording to get similar results. So we're going to do a little bit of an experiment now. I also do want to acknowledge that I see questions in the chat. So maybe before we do this experiment, I will go through the questions and then we'll do our little experiment. So James has asked, any thoughts on alignment versus interest and where we might want to look at proximity/access to stakeholders? Um, Yes, I think I'll get into this later on in the slides in terms of when you're actually building your matrix, but there's a whole bunch of different variables that you can use, which I'll go through in more detail later. The variables that you use just depend on, again, that purpose and what you're trying to actually achieve. So if you're looking to stakeholders that you'd be able to sort of bring into research projects, maybe you would want to look at sort of proximity instead of influence. So how likely it is that you'd be able to work with them. And then Jennifer highlighted that the power interest matrix is available online. Thanks very much for sharing that. Then there's a question about agile methods. So many projects using agile methods don't seem to develop stakeholder lists. This is quite frustrating for those of us doing assurance. Is this common in agile project management? Um, I mean, so I did do my Prince 2 Agile Project Management qualification. So technically I have that. Do I remember doing, I don't think, I'm trying to rack my brain. Um, no, I don't think this sort of in-depth stakeholder mapping was part of any of the project management techniques that I was taught when I was doing my Prince 2 Agile. Um, I think you could definitely incorporate, I just find that stakeholder mapping is so valuable for projects and that you also don't have to do something as systematic as I've done, which has sort of been an ongoing activity over several months. And you could definitely do something that's quick and dirty, just desk-based, really. Do that, do the initial desk-based search in an afternoon, and then do a bit of an activity just with the internal team over an hour of putting people around the map. So I think it's definitely a technique that can be adapted into a more agile project management scope. And I would advocate for that being done. And yeah, so Jennifer has mentioned that it is very time consuming, but it is best practice, but convincing people to do it. So what I have found helpful was within my role within my research center, I'm the impact manager. And so I haven't really given people the option about doing it. I've just been sort of saying that this is an activity, but it definitely has been time consuming. I think I started the initial desk-based research, so the stages that we've got up to it now, I started that in November. Then the stakeholder mapping creation, like the actual matrix activity took place in the end of November. We're now in March, and I'm now at the stage of actually reaching out to the individual high priority stakeholders. So it has been many months in development. Obviously, it would be a lot faster if I had dedicated all of my time to this. So I haven't just solely been working on the stakeholder matrix, but it does take a long time if you want to do it really, really thoroughly. But I think it's going to be incredibly valuable in the background for our work because I can see us being able to have sort of numerous new connections and bringing new people into our research project. But you don't have, I'm kind of doing it as as systematic as possible, but if you don't have that kind of time and resource, I think it can be done sort of in a more streamlined approach. There's a question about, is there a more efficient AI tool for prompting? Um, There could be, but I've only used Copilot. So within my institution at UCL, Copilot is the institutionally supported AI platform. So that is what and I've been using Copilot because it's gone through the appropriate checks. It would be interesting, I think, maybe to see if someone wanted to do an experiment to do it across a couple of different platforms to see the pros and cons of both. So if anyone wants to do that and get back to us, I'd be interested. But fortunately, I can't answer that question myself. If anyone else has similarly used AI to do stakeholder mapping, feel free to share that in the chat or out loud. And now I see that thank you for all the great questions. And I see that people have also already been doing the experiment. So thank you very much, Elise, for putting that into the chat. So this is just to show that the same prompt will have, um, yeah, different outputs. And just seeing like there's completely different stakeholders that people have brought up. Someone has said Hosea said it really highlights why we emphasize the importance of a strong online presence for academics, departments, and organizations. Without it, our chances of showing up in an AI-generated outputs are much lower. Yeah, that's right. If you're not on the internet across a different number of different sources, it's more unlikely, it's less likely that an AI platform would pull you out. It's quite interesting as well in the organizations that people have been identifying. Some seem to be very area specific. Like some people have been pulling out a lot of, there's one person whose stakeholders they pulled out were a lot of them are based in Scotland. So maybe that the AI was built basing that off of your previous search histories. There are some similarities, like I see the Health Foundation, the King's Fund has come up, but they're all very different. So that's just to show really that if your AI is familiar with your previous searches, it might be biased towards any specific geographic area. It also, I think, hopefully just shows don't rely solely on AI outputs. I think it's a really good framework and a really great way to get ideas of an area, but being able to triangulate across a number of different sources, doing a hand search, social media search, and triangulating with colleagues is really important. It's not one and done. Once you can't just rely solely on an AI platform. So people have been finding that these three Scottish ones seem to be coming up. So they must have some really great search engine optimization. That's what someone has said, SEO. So thank you very much for everyone who participated in the little experiment. Just reading through, it's great to see that people are sharing their different experiences using different engines and AI platforms. Yes, people are saying that Copilot seemed to like Scotland. Um, but then people who haven't used it before finding that there's less of an area-specific bias. All right. So this is just an example. This is a screenshot actually from my Copilot Exchange. So I asked it, create a list of organizations, charities, groups, select committees, APPGs, bodies in the UK that work in the area of work and social inequalities. So work was one of our main, is one of our main work themes. So that's why I specified that I wanted the organizations to be based around work. It then came up with a list that you can see here. It was helpful that Copilot gave like little one-word explainers. I knew that it wasn't completely out to lunch because it listed some organizations that we actually already partner with, as well as organizations that I was already familiar with. So I was semi-confident that these were somewhat relevant. I also found that using Copilot was really useful to complete the data collection because without it, I would have been filling in my table with all of the columns manually, which when I've done this in the past, pre-AI days, took me many, many days to do. But I would say that with the stakeholder mapping activity, if you only used it for one portion, using it for the data collection was extremely helpful. So the prompt that I created was create a spreadsheet for these organizations with columns for, and then I listed out the different column headers, and then I copy and pasted in the list of the organizations. If you have a lot of organizations, it's easier to work in batches and then merge the spreadsheets. I had, I think, 50 stakeholders, and that just broke Copilot and it didn't work. So as annoying as it was, I found that doing it in batches of around 50 organizations, downloading the spreadsheet and then merging them all into one was the easiest way to do. So as a word of warning, Copilot or AI platforms also face workload capacity issues. So it was one afternoon, maybe I was a bit tired, a little bit grumpy, and I got so frustrated because it was just spinning its wheel for a good 20 minutes. Um, so I would say that Copilot's very polite, even when I wasn't so much. But yes, I found that doing batches was a lot easier. This shows you the exchange that I used within Copilot to create the data, to create my data collection template. So I listed out the different columns: email address, website, nation, focus, and then copied in the different organizations. And then after a couple of seconds, it created a downloadable Excel file. And so I just did this. I think I had 5 individual spreadsheets, which I just combined into one. I probably could have asked Copilot to then take all of the files and combine them, but I was fine to just do it by hand. So this is an example of what my actual data collection sheets looked like. Just a word of warning in terms of email addresses. I found, at least with Copilot, it's unable to extract individual email addresses, even if they're publicly available. So a lot of the times with organizations, or especially with academics, their emails will be on publicly available websites. But I think something around in the background of Copilot's sort of data protection and privacy, it can only provide generic email addresses, and individual emails have to be found by hand. So that's why if I was to do this again, I wouldn't have even bothered asking Copilot to pull out email addresses. And so the slightly annoying bit is now that we've got our high priority stakeholders, having to do desk-based search for stakeholders this way. But you can see we've got the organization, the website. Copilot was good in terms of identifying which nation they were based in, and if it was UK-wide, it would just say UK. And then it also was really useful for writing out a one-liner description of what they work in. I'm just going to go back in the chat before we go on to the next section to see if there's so there's a question in terms of how can you ensure all information provided is genuine and not hallucinated. I think you could do so what I did was took a random sample. It probably wasn't statistically random, but I just took of the 50 stakeholders, I checked 5 of them to make sure. I checked the website, is it a real website, and then just checked to make sure that the information that was taken out in data collection actually matched which was on the website. And it was all, I didn't see any issues, so then I just felt like I could trust it after that. Okay, that's interesting. Jose said, for me, ChatGPT has actually been quite good at guessing email address structures. So yeah, like if you can figure out the institutional framework for email, so if it's like first name dot last name at blah, 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 then you can sometimes figure out emails that way. So it's interesting that within ChatGPT can pull it out. Copilot, whereas with Copilot, it just simply refused. So maybe, yeah, so you can try using, if you have access to different platforms, you can try them out and see which one works the best for you. Okay, so a couple other people are saying ChatGPT has been good at finding email addresses. So that is a good tip and good to know. So the steps, so once you've got your long list of all your stakeholders, now is a fun bit. So this is where you actually get to start putting people in the matrix. And now I feel like Neo. So the first is around creating your template. So that's where we're going back to choosing the different axes that you want to be working with. Often the variables, the axes that are used are the level of interest or level of influence. That's what I chose for my activity, but you can choose other dimensions based off of the objectives and purpose of your activity. So level of investment, level of positive or negative commitment, if you're looking sort of more in the advocacy space, level of support. Someone had mentioned earlier in the chat, proximity or access to different stakeholders, how much they need outcomes. So the variables that you use, the axes that you use really just depends on the purpose and what you're trying to achieve. And the resulting matrix will indicate the engagement strategy needed for each stakeholder. When you then go to positioning stakeholders within the matrix, you need to think about, will the stakeholders be affected by your project, or can they actually influence your project? Do they have influence over necessary resources? Are they funders? and also think about what stage your stakeholders have the most impact in. So when we did our stakeholder mapping, there were some stakeholders who have a lot of influence, such as MPs, but we've made a note that actually we only want to be engaging with them when we actually have findings, because it's unlikely that an MP would have time to actually be involved with the nitty-gritty of the research, and it would be more likely that they'd be interested in engaging once we've got some really good findings. So the act of positioning stakeholders in the matrix is a really, really great way to engage stakeholders, either individually within your existing team, or if you're holding some kind of external workshop, conference, meeting, it's a really great way to engage partners and stakeholders. We found that for the exercise that we ran, when we ran it at one of our center conference days, where we had partners from both academia, but also from the third sector and from the policy world. It was a really great way to learn from their expertise and their knowledge. Um, if you're doing an in-person activity like a workshop, this can be done physically with flip chart papers and flashcards, as you can see in the picture here. So this is a picture from the actual 1-hour workshop that I ran at our center day. But it can also be done online using platforms like Microsoft Whiteboard, Miro, or Group Map, if you're doing something that's hybrid or online. And so I'm just wanted to see if I'd be able to bring up the whiteboard now, but I might not be able to. No, I can't at the moment. Sorry, I'm navigating across 3 different screens, so my cursor sometimes gets lost. So this is an example of the instructions that I actually gave to all of our participants. So in-person attendees were invited to choose the map that they wanted to work on. So I had a different map for the 4 different thematic areas, and people could move around and choose which map they wanted to work on. The online attendees worked on a map around health inequalities, so they didn't have the choice, unfortunately. People were asked to place the physical cards according to their levels of influence and interest. And the key bit of information was, do not place a card on the axis, because you need to be decisive, especially with a lot of academics in the room. We found that no one really wanted to commit, and there was a lot of, well, maybe they could be high interest, but maybe they're low interest. No, make a decision, because when it comes to the next stages, you really need to have people in specific quadrants. I also provided blank cards because I knew inevitably there would have been stakeholders that I hadn't identified, so having the blank cards available meant that people could write them in as they were going. I also asked people to add their names to a card if they had connections with the stakeholders, because this would help us with future engagement, because it's often easier to start communications with someone if you've had a brokered introduction as opposed to just metaphorically cold calling them. So here's some photos from the actual in-person activity. I had the maps that I made using the flip chart paper. Each card I used on cue cards. The information that I included was the name, the one-liner, as well as the geographic area, nation within the UK where they were based. So I made sure that the cards had what I thought was the most key bits of information. I also had prints out of our existing partners, so that way people wouldn't be asking, well, why aren't X, Y, and Z listed? So they already knew who we were already aware of, and the activity instructions, and included the blank cards for new stakeholders for people to be added. Something that I also found really helpful was having a facilitator for each of the maps to sort of answer any questions, but also to sort of guide the conversation. So I would recommend, if you are doing this in person, have a facilitator for each of your tables. And I had a briefing session with them beforehand to make sure everything was going to run smoothly. I also created these cards via Copilot, so it was a useful way to be able to combine all the information into one Word document with just a couple of prompts. Again, because I was creating the cards over a couple of days, I found that the prompt that worked for me the first day created a completely different result the second day. So it did take a little bit of iterating the prompt until I got what I wanted. And this is a screenshot of the online stakeholder map that I used for the online participants. I used Microsoft Whiteboard. Um, I found Whiteboard was easy to use because external users were able to access the board without logging in because it was shared via Teams. So the facilitator just shared it via the existing Teams link, and that way it avoided people having to create usernames or to log in. In this case, the facilitator was the one who moved the sticky notes across the map and created new ones. The attendees had decided they kind of just wanted to guide the conversations, but this is just what the group decided. People were also able to move the sticky notes around as well. And amazingly, people actually had fun. These are all genuine smiles on people's faces, and no one was prompted or paid to smile. I had feedback afterwards that it was one of the highlights of the day. It was also a really great way for people to do some networking without being told that they were networking. And it also was genuinely useful for the work that I've been doing since then. So if you're looking for a way to break up a session and have some kind of hands-on interactive activity, this was a really fun thing to do. I'm just going to go into the chat before we get into the very last stage, which is around engagement. Yes, and someone has said have to check everything and flag that it's been produced with AI. Yeah, so institutions are beginning to come up with sort of policies and rules for around the use of AI, and I think UCL has a statement. Elise might know this more than me about if you've used AI in work to flag this and acknowledge this. Someone's asked, will we be talking about a way to update the stakeholder matrix over time? Yes, I'll be mentioning that later on. And yes, you can see that people ignored my instructions to not have cards on the axis, and there were lots and lots of cards that were on axes. So when I went to consolidate all of the findings, I had to go to the table facilitators and ask them to make a unilateral decision about where they would go. So if I was to run this again, I would be a bit more dictatorial in terms of telling people like you can't put something on an axis because things on an axis are pretty useless to deal with afterwards. Someone asked, when doing the exercise over various days, did you return to the previous chat/prompt in Copilot or open new chats and try the same prompt? I think I copy and pasted the prompt that I had used into a new prompt, and that generated sometimes different results. Perhaps if I had gone into the previous chat and rerun it, it would have come up with the same response. It would have come up with a more similar response. So I think maybe that's a good tip. If anyone is running prompts over several days, try going back to the original prompt instead of starting a new one. And someone suggested as well, maybe making the axes red would be a good visual reminder. Yes, so using color to help people engage with the activity, and just a reminder of like, don't put anything on here. So once you've got your maps, you can see in the pictures here, you've got all of them placed across. Yeah, there's the one right in the bullseye. So then I had all of these maps. And then what I did was to consolidate them. So I collated them based off of the prioritized group. So putting them I used Excel and I put them into the 4 different quadrants. And it was just a matter of moving things around my existing spreadsheets. And this way I could visually see how many stakeholders I had across each theme in the different priority areas. I did a tally and found that there is a lot that had been flagged as managed closely, so that was the highest priority group. But just by having a tally, it was good to have an overview of how many sort of stakeholders fell within each of the priority groups. I then just had a little think around what the purpose of engaging with the different priority groups were and the different actions that we'd be taking. So I decided with my communications officer that the low priority groups would be receiving just a more generic email introducing the center, being invited to join our external newsletter, and also connecting them with them on socials, whereas the high priority groups would receive individual targeted emails with invitations to have a meeting. We might, with some, invite them to join our advisory groups or to join in to present at our weekly seminars. When you go to develop your engagement plan, so once you've got your prioritized groups, you want to think about a timeline for implementation, engagement, and evaluation. So how are you actually going to evaluate whether your exercise is working, whether things need to be tweaked? What do you actually want to get out of the engagement? So that's why we decided with the high priority groups, we wanted to set up meetings and invite people to join our advisory groups, whereas with the lower ones, the objective was basically just to have more people join our newsletter. The also within your priority groups, you want to look at whether you already have existing relationships with them and whether you've got people within your network or your team who already has relationships that you would be able to leverage. People that you reach out to it might not necessarily be best to reach out to the senior people or CEOs. So have a look to see who supports them and who's actually working in the specific area. So the people that we've been looking to target are actually more of the policy officers, the research officers. And check their policy priority areas and mention statements and areas of focus to see where those where you can identify where the points of alignment are. Have they published papers, blogs that are similar to your area? That's all of this information is really key for when you go to crafting your sort of introductory engagement. Because we had 49 high priority stakeholders, we just don't have the capacity to be trying to build one-on-one relationships with all of them. So then what I asked each of my theme teams to do was to do a red, amber, green exercise within the high priority groups. So within these groups, green, who do we want to really start? Who do you want me to focus on? Amber is less urgent, and red, actually on second look, they could be moved down to a lower priority group. So if you do end up having a lot of high priority stakeholders, you can do a prioritization of the prioritized. And then it's implementing your engagement plan. So aside ownership, so who's responsible for reaching out to people, make sure that your messages are well crafted, and you can use different methods. So you might be sending out emails. It might actually be most useful to send out direct messages on social media. Often, if you can meet people in person, that's the easiest way to actually start building a connection. So if look to see if there's events that you can attend where you can meet people in person. This obviously takes more time and resources, but if you are able to meet people in person, it really makes it a lot easier to start building that relationship. So I've been working with my communications officer to start implementing our engagement plans. This is an example of the generic email that will be going out sort of via mail merge to the lower priority groups, just introducing the center as well as providing links to our socials and the newsletter, whereas the high priority stakeholders are receiving individual tailored emails. Now, if I was doing this presentation a couple of weeks from now, I would then be able to give you some stats in terms of we've had X number of uptake on the newsletter. We've now set up 10 meetings, but unfortunately, we're not at that stage yet. But that's something that I would be doing in terms of the evaluation to see how this went. Some final thoughts. The stakeholder map is not static, so it will evolve as your project progresses. Someone had asked, are there any tips for how you would actually go about reviewing and iterating your stakeholder map? That's a really good question. I think I'm really just thinking about this on the spot. Potentially what you could do is what I would be doing is in a year's time circulating the spreadsheet and asking my internal team, have you made connections with any additional stakeholders? Are there any new teams that you're aware of? But then also putting the map into an AI prompt and asking, are there any additional organizations relevant in this area in addition to the existing organizations that are listed here? So I think doing an internal person-based triangulation of have you asking colleagues and then also running it through AI as well. And I'm also updating the maps as we go. So as I hear from a colleague that they've worked with, found a new organization, I've updated the list. So just last week, my director messaged, oh, do we have so-and-so on this list? We didn't, so I've added them. So it's something that I kind of, it's not just once a year that I'll be looking at these. It's sort of as and when names come up. This is the last slide. If anyone has questions, I'm really happy for you to get in touch. I'm going to go through to see um, if there's any other questions. Someone said, make sure you're say please and thank you to your AI. I think, yes, when I was a bit stroppy with my AI and told it to hurry up, I then did say thank you afterwards. Whether it actually made a difference, I'm not sure. So yeah, I'll stay on for another couple of minutes. I'll stop the recording.